Welcome back to the series of lectures on high-performance scientific computing. One of the most important things about high-performance scientific computers is the fact that it is a shared resource. Typically, these large machines are shared by several hundreds of people together, and they all run their scientific codes simultaneously on these large machines. One of the important things when such large number of people are working together individually on their codes is proper resource allocation. So today we will look at harnessing the power of SLURM and PBS, which are used for scheduling work on these HPC machines. They optimize HPC workloads. So what is the need for these HPC schedulers? First of all, you need to have efficient utilization of the HPC resources. So job schedulers like SLURM and PBS, they play a crucial role in maximizing the utilization of the HPC systems by sort of very intelligently allocating resources to workloads. You need the schedulers to help manage and prioritize different workloads based on factors such as job requirements, because for example, some users' job might require 1,000 processors, the other users' job might require maybe 100 processors, some users' job might require 100 processors for 48 hours, whereas another user might require 10,000 processors maybe only for 2 hours. So when we look at the job requirements such as users, number of cores, user priorities and system policies, we need to have a sort of workload management. Robust job schedulers can handle large-scale diverse workloads where you have small jobs for longer periods of time or large jobs for shorter periods of time or a mix of both. And they adapt to the changing system conditions and resource availability. One key thing that we always have to remember is the fairness and equitable resource allocation. Schedulers implement policies to ensure fair and equitable distribution of resources among users and projects. Now let us have an overview of SLURM. SLURM is a powerful job scheduler that manages and allocates computational resources on HPC systems. It uses sophisticated algorithms to prioritize jobs based on factors like who the user is, what the project is, and what is the fair share policy. It is designed to scale to large HPC environments. By large, I mean hundreds or even thousands of compute nodes and lots of cores. It also offers very robust fault tolerance mechanism in the sense that if a node goes down for some reason, then it automatically detects the node has gone down, transfers certain jobs if it is already existing there, or takes the node offline so that no further jobs will be scheduled over there. It provides us a comprehensive set of commands for submitting, monitoring, and managing jobs on these large systems. It also supports advanced features like job dependencies, checkpointing, burst buffer support for improved workload management. So how do you deploy SLURM in an HPC cluster? First of all, you need to install the SLURM package. You need to configure the SLURM configuration file. You will have to set up a database which stores information about job submissions, resource usage and cluster state. You need to configure what are called the SLURM daemons or the background processes which control and look at the database to enable job scheduling and management. You obviously need to integrate SLURM with the HPC infrastructure such as the resource managers, job submission interfaces and monitoring tools. And during the early stages, you'll have to thoroughly test and validate the deployment to ensure that the job submission, resource allocation, and other critical functionalities are working as expected. And you need to continuously monitor and optimize SLURM configuration based on the specific workload characteristics, because this itself is an evolving creature, because the kind of jobs that will come will evolve over time. So now let us look at a few SLURM job submission and monitoring commands. The command that you'll use to submit your jobs into the queue is called sbatch. It specifies job parameters such as what are the resource requirements, i.e. the number of nodes, number of cores, whether it's a GPU queue or a CPU queue. It gives the name for that specific job and provides the execution script. You can use the srun command to launch interactive jobs or parallel tasks within a job. This allows you to monitor the progress and output of your jobs in real time. The sq command gives you the status of your submitted jobs using the the above said command. You can view information about the job IDs, job names, who is the user, how much resource has been allocated, and what is the job state, whether it is pending, whether it is running, or whether it has been completed. Let us say that you want to cancel a job which is running. So for that, you would use the scancel command, and which will be used to terminate a running job. Essentially, this is useful when you realize that your simulation or calculation is no longer useful and is no longer producing useful results, or it has encountered some other issues. That's when you would go and cancel the job so that it doesn't use any further resources. The sinfo command gives you information about the current state of the SLURM cluster, including things like what nodes are available, what is the resource utilization, and what the different partition or the queues configurations are. We can integrate SLURM with job monitoring tools such as Ganglia and Grafana to visualize this data at the job level or look at system-wide performance metrics. So there are different policies for utilization of the cluster efficiently. So you could have a fair share policy which might give you 85% efficiency, a priority queue which might give 90%. These are such some numbers which are given as examples. So you can see how these allocation policies will effectively determine your cluster utilization. And this is specific to each cluster that is there. These are just examples. So the SLURM's job prioritization and fair share algorithms are essential for ensuring the equitable resource distribution among users and projects. SLURM prioritizes jobs based on the combination of factors such as the job age, user, group fair share, resource utilization. The fair share algorithm tracks resource consumption over time, allowing SLURM to dynamically adjust job priority to balance workloads and prevent individual users or groups from monopolizing and using the system. SLURM also has certain advanced features, for example, job dependencies. It will allow users to define dependencies between jobs, ensuring that certain jobs run only after their dependencies are met. So let's say that you have a task A which needs to be done only after task B is completed. So you can then put these dependencies in SLURM. So this enables complex workflows and you can do task orchestration in HPC environments. SLURM also supports checkpointing, which allows jobs to be periodically saved and restarted from the last checkpoint, which gives you a certain level of fault tolerance and ability to resume jobs in case the system fails or there are interruptions. It also integrates burst buffer technologies, which provides advanced data staging and I/O acceleration capabilities. This is very helpful in data intensive workloads and it enables efficient management of burst buffer resources. It also has dynamic resource allocation to allow for efficient utilization of system resources, automatically adjusting job allocations based on the changing workload demands and system conditions. It provides support for job arrays, enabling submission and management of a collection of similar jobs as a single unit. For example, if you want to do large-scale parallel workloads or parametric sweeps, it allows you to do job array support. Similar to SLURM, we have the portable batch system, which is another load balancing or a workload management system. It has a long history tracing back to early 90s as a job scheduler for supercomputing environments. It follows a client-server architecture where the PBS server manages job queues, resource allocation, and job scheduling across a cluster of compute nodes. It offers a key range of features including job submission, monitoring, prioritization, fair share, resource provisioning, and making it a really powerful tool for HPC workload management. Similar to SLURM, you have to submit jobs in PBS using the QSub command, and you can specify what resources that are required in a job script, and you can put various options to customize the job execution. You can monitor the job status using the qstart command, which gives you the list of submitted jobs, including their queue position, resource usage, and completion status. You can leverage the qdel command to cancel running or pending jobs that you have submitted using qsub to see if the job is running well or not. You can define job dependencies using the -w depend option in the qsub command, ensuring that jobs are executed in a certain order. This is again for workflow management. You can employ PBS checkpoint and restart features to enable job checkpointing and seamless restart in the case of system failures or preemption. The PBS resource provisioning and allocation looks at the number of CPU cores utilized, the amount of memory that is allocated, the disk space that is consumed, and including the network bandwidth that is utilized. So you need to understand what the PBS fair share and priority policies are. So you can learn how PBS calculates fair share and prioritizes jobs. You can explore different combinations of fair share policies and implement them. And you can understand the impact of factors like job age, resource requirements, and user group priority on job scheduling. PBS, similar to SLURM, has advanced features where it supports array jobs which allow you to submit multiple similar jobs as a single job submission. This is very useful in the case of the same task that needs to be run on multiple input files or you want to do parameter sweeps. So it can also do dynamic provisioning of resources where it can enable the scheduler to automatically provision and deallocate resources based on job requirements, and this can improve the overall system utilization and efficiency. It also supports preemption, which allows high priority jobs to interrupt and suspend low priority jobs, ensuring that critical workloads are processed in a timely manner. And PBS can manage and allocate GPU resources, enabling users to leverage GPU accelerated computing on their HPC workloads. So if you look at the comparison of SLURM and PBS in terms of job throughput, job latency, and resource utilization efficiency, you can get statistics similar to this, like what is the job throughput, what is the job latency, how much time it waits, and what is sort of the resource utilization. We then finally have hybrid scheduler environments. So in some HPC systems, you can have a combination of SLURM and PBS job schedulers, which are known as a hybrid scheduler environment. This allows the HPC system to leverage the unique strengths and capabilities of both these schedulers and meet their specific workload requirements. Essentially, it gives improved flexibility in job management by allowing using specific features and policies of each scheduler, and it enhances the resource utilization by using these strengths. What are the challenges of implementing and managing a hybrid scheduler environment is the increased complexity in job submission and monitoring due to the need to understand both the unique commands and syntax of each scheduler. There could be some potential conflicts and inconsistencies in resource allocation if there is such a hybrid scheduler. So it requires the need for comprehensive training and documentation to use it effectively. So many organizations and many HPC systems have successfully implemented and managed hybrid scheduler environments, and we can leverage the strengths of both SLURM and PBS, and there are certain case studies on it. So what are the different performance optimization strategies? Resource provisioning strategies, basically to carefully allocate CPU, memory, and other resources based on job requirements. You need to look at workload profiling and monitoring, analyze job characteristics and system performance metrics to identify bottlenecks and opportunities for optimization. Scheduler configuration tuning, optimize SLURM and PBS parameters such as scheduling policies, backfilling, preemption to improve overall system throughput. Obviously, we need to look at this through the lens of job prioritization and fair share algorithms to ensure that there's an equitable resource distribution and high priorities for job completion. So we can look at job dependencies and workflow management tools to optimize execution of complex interdependent HPC workloads. What are the best practices that we need to have? Monitor the system utilization. Regularly monitor CPU, memory, and storage utilization to identify potential bottlenecks. Keep ensuring that your job configurations such as resource requests and constraints are aligned with the actual resource requirements to maximize efficiency. You can leverage caching mechanisms such as warm-up periods or checkpointing to reduce the job startup times and improve overall throughput. You can properly handle job dependencies to ensure efficient scheduling and avoid unnecessary waiting or delays. You can implement a robust logging practice to facilitate troubleshooting, performance analysis, and system auditing. And more importantly, you need to provide excellent user training and support. So there have been several case studies and success stories. For example, there's an automotive manufacturer which has used SLURM to optimize their vehicle simulation. It reduces computation time by about 30%. Universities routinely use these sort of queuing systems, which results in about like 25% improvement in throughput. Also, weather prediction agencies use SLURM to better distribute and parallelize their complex weather modeling simulations. It leads to almost 20% improvement in forecasting accuracy. So this is how essentially you would need to integrate SLURM and PBS with HPC systems. You would look at the integration into HPC middleware. You look at compatibility with containerization. You look at interfacing, monitoring and visualization tools, collaboration of storage and file systems, and hopefully, if you want to extend it, interoperability with cloud-based HPC services, where you can extend the HPC capacity to on the cloud, or you could interact with multiple cloud environments and put them all together. Finally, you can integrate all this with machine learning and AI frameworks to do AI-driven HPC workloads. All this puts us to the effort of having an ecosystem for collaboration and also standardization. The key conclusion is that we need to have efficient HPC workload management. We need to leverage the advanced features of both SLURM and PBS, and we need to have a look at certain hybrid scheduler strategies. Thank you.